All right, good morning. That is Uncle Lou here. That's right, it is me, Uncle Lou, live on LouTube for you. Thanks for watching. This is a video I've been thinking about for a while, and I've done versions of a similar video in the past, and I've even done a video this year, I think a month or two ago, about what I think are some of the biggest games in college football this year, or the most important games, or whatever the case. But specifically in this video, I want to talk about some of the top teams heading into the season and must-win games. Trying to find one particular game on these teams' schedules that I would classify as must-win. Now, when I say must-win, every team's must-win game that I've got circled, and I'm going to put them up in a minute, it's not the same reason for every team that I think a certain game might be must-win. Like, there could be some games that I think a team must win, in order to make the playoffs, or a certain game that a team must win if they plan on winning a national title, or a must-win game because of it could be a lot of different. It could be a lot of different for perception, or maybe a team has lost to a team a lot of times recently, and so it's a must-win thing. Like, they got to get over this one hump. So I'll tell you my reasoning when I get to these teams must-win games, but just keep in mind, when I say must-win, I don't mean like must-win or else their season is over. It varies from team to team. So, and I'm not going to go in any particular order here. So, what I did, ESPN just released their FBI top 25, which I don't like the top 25 in terms of a ranking. And of course, the FBI is not really a ranking, it's a rating. I don't want to get into the difference between a ranking and a rating in that much detail, but a ranking is generally someone or some group of people's opinions of who the best teams are based on their own personal criteria, whereas a rating or a power rating is more based on Vegas odds. Team 1 would beat team 2 on a neutral field. Team 2 would beat team 3 on a neutral field. Team 3 would beat team 4 on a neutral field. And when I say beat them, obviously, the game's got to be played. Anybody can win. I'm talking the odds. So, like, team 1 would be favored over team 2. Team 2 would be favored over team 3. Team 3 would be that's what a power rating is. It's kind of what the FBI is. I'm not using the FBI to tell you that this is the right or wrong ranking or rating. It's just I wanted to pull up a list of top teams and pick out some must-win games for certain teams. And the FBI is the most recent, like, rating or ranking that has come out. It came out just a couple of days ago. So ESPN's FBI has Georgia ranked number 1. And to me, there's a real clear must-win game here on the schedule for Georgia. Now, Georgia's got a lot of big games this year. They open up with Clemson. That's always an exciting game. They've got 3 huge road games at Bama, at Texas, at Southern Miss that a lot of people are talking about. They've got a big road game early in the year at Kentucky. And their quarterback is a transfer from Georgia. That will be his first SEC start at home against Georgia right there in week 3. They play Tennessee at home late in the year. There's the in-state rival game, Georgia Tech at the end. So Auburn game is a rivalry. You got Florida game in there. There's a lot of big games for Georgia. But to me, one stands out as the must-win game, and it's at Alabama. Now, the SEC is wide open this year. In my mind, there's 4 or 5 teams that could wind up in the SEC title game, and I wouldn't be surprised if any 2 of those 4 or 5 wind up there. Now, obviously, if somebody like Florida, even at Texas A&M, honestly, I'd be surprised if LSU wound up in the SEC title game. But the 4 or 5 teams that most people talk about in terms of making the SEC title game, of course, are Georgia, Bama, Texas, Ole Miss, and then maybe Missouri is kind of on the bubble there with that top group of teams in terms of like chances to make the SEC title game. So this game here at Alabama. Now, Georgia could win this game by 100 or lose this game by 100. And I really don't think it will have an overall effect on how Georgia finishes the season. I don't think anybody in the SEC is going undefeated. I've said that a bunch of times. And the goal really for an SEC team should be to make the playoffs. Now, obviously, if you win the SEC, you get that first round bye, so there's some incentive there. But it's not that I think this, like the Georgia has to win this game at Alabama, or else they're not making the SEC title game, or they're not making the playoffs, or the season would be somehow a failure. The reason I think Georgia needs to win this game at Alabama is because Kirby has basically dominated the college football world over the last 6 or 7 years, with the exception, of course, being Alabama. Now, as Georgia fans, some of us have said, well, it's Nick Saban. He's the best coach of all time. There's no shame in losing to Nick Saban. Yeah, I wish we had more wins over Bama, but, what can you do? At least we're not losing to, Billy Napier or, whatever fill in the blank coach here. You get beat by Saban, you pick yourself up and you move along. Well, Saban's gone. And it's not that I don't think Kalen DeBoer is a great coach. I think he is a great coach. But, that's sort of like the last kind of built-in excuse that Georgia fans have had for because what is Kirby, 1-5 against Bama? I think, something like that. The only win coming in the national title game in 2021. Lost to him in the national title game in 2017. Lost to him in the SEC championship game in 2018. Lost to him in the regular season during COVID. Lost to him in the SEC championship game in 21. Anyway, I believe it's 1-5. Lost to him last year, of course, again in the SEC championship game. So he's 1-5 against Bama, but of course, all 6 of those games was Kirby versus Saban. And so you've kind of had that built in. Well, yeah, Bama's, had the better of us, but they had the best coach in the history of college football. Well, he's gone now. And like I said, I think DeBoer's a good coach, but from a perception and like a mental hurdle, getting over the Bama hurdle, I think it's important. This is, I think, if you're gonna find a must-win game here, I think it's this one. If Georgia goes into Alabama and loses this game in week 4 with a brand new coaching staff in place and some legitimate questions about their team overall, I mean, they're one of the best teams in the country. They'll have a great offensive line. I think their run game will be really, really good, but they've got a bunch of unproven wide receivers, and Jalen Milroe has never really impressed anybody in terms of his ability to throw the ball. And he's a great athlete. And, what kind of magic can Kalen DeBoer do with Jalen Milroe? We saw what he did with Michael Penix. So Alabama could be a really, really good team. But if Georgia, who most people have ranked ahead of Alabama heading into the season, loses to Alabama again this year with a new head coach and with some of those questions that they have, even on the defensive side of the ball, I think it's just a bad look for Georgia and Kirby in particular. It's just, sort of the proverbial monkey that they can't get off their back. Some people, myself included, thought maybe that they had cleared that hurdle with a win against Saban and Alabama in the 2021 national title game. But, of course, then you fast forward to last year, and they lose to Bama again. And Georgia has been a favorite against Bama half the time they've played. So it's not like Georgia has been playing Alabama as a severe underdog. It's not like Georgia has been playing Alabama and everybody was picking Alabama to win. Georgia has been the favorite half the times that they've played Bama, yet they only have the one win. I think it's a huge win for sort of the mental aspect of it for Georgia as a program. Can they get over the Bama hump? Now, was it Saban that was kind of the boogeyman for Kirby Smart in Georgia, or was it just Alabama? They just can't beat Alabama. We'll find out this year on the road in Tuscaloosa when Georgia plays them in, week 4, I guess. Georgia has a bye week before that game. It's early in the season. You wouldn't expect there to be any injury issues for either side. So you would think this would be an opportunity for Kirby and Georgia to go in there and kind of, exert their dominance over the SEC with a win on the road at Bama. And if they can't get it, I feel like it's probably not a very good look. All right, let's move on to another team on the list here. I guess I'll just continue to use the FPI here and just kind of go through the list. I'm not going to talk about every team. Like I said, the rankings of these teams is not the point. We've got Georgia at 1. Let's see. They've got Oregon at 2. I really don't think Oregon has a must-win game this year. I know the game where they host Ohio State is huge, but you look at Oregon's schedule, nothing like jumps out to me like for one particular reason or another. Like they have to win this game. They host Ohio State. They play on the road at Michigan. They could split those games. They'll probably still find themselves in the Big Ten title game. So I think they're a really, really good team. Texas. Okay, now this is an obvious one for me. I do have one for Texas here. Let's put Texas' schedule up on the screen. To me, this is another one that's really, really obvious, and it's going to be for a completely different reason than before. Huge games for Texas as well, on the road at Michigan, right? An SEC schedule for the first time. So pretty much every conference game Texas plays is going to be big to certain groups of people, right? Their first SEC game at home against Mississippi State. That's a huge game for Texas because it's their first SEC game. Big game for Mississippi State because they get to play Texas. The Oklahoma Red River Shootout, big game every year. They host Georgia. That'll be one of the biggest games of the season in all of college football. They play Florida. They play Kentucky. But it's that last game of the regular season to me, without doubt. This is the must-win game. And if I were to do a must-win game for Texas A&M, it would be this same game. This is one of the best rivalries of my lifetime in college football. I grew up watching this game every single Thanksgiving, year after year after year. And thanks to the conference realignment and expansion from almost 15 years ago now, we lost this game on a yearly basis, Texas and Texas A&M, the two schools, the two administrations. Feelings were hurt. They were never able to get together and get this game scheduled. But now that Texas is a part of the SEC, neither team can accuse the other of running and hiding anymore. They're going to be forced to play probably every year going forward in the SEC. And the first year of that is this year, last week of the regular season, November 30th, on the road at Texas A&M. If you're a Texas fan, I know everything's about the OU game, and I get that. And I'm not here to tell you that the Texas A&M game is going to somehow supplant Texas-Oklahoma as like Texas' biggest game of the year going forward. But this year in particular, for my money, this is the must-win game for Texas. Texas could go 11-0 and lose at Texas A&M. And again, it won't have any effect on Texas in the postseason. An 11-1 Texas would have lost to Texas A&M is still going to go to the SEC title game. So it has nothing to do with postseason seeding or ability to make the SEC title game, right? It's just a perception thing. It's a rivalry thing. It's the fans. What's funny is the kids that are going to play in this game, the players for Texas and the players for Texas A&M. How old were they in 2011? Is that the last time this game was played? I mean, you're talking almost 15 years ago now for players that are between the ages of 18 and 22. I mean, these kids were 3, 4, 5 years old the last time this game was played. They don't know. They didn't grow up watching this game. Now, they've heard about it. Being at the two schools, I'm sure it's something that has been talked about. But fan bases do remember. There are plenty of Texas and Texas A&M fans who were alive in the 80s and 90s and up through the 2000s and even before that have been that have watched this game 20, 30, 40, 50 times. And it is going to be a huge game for all of those people. And for that reason, this is the must-win game for Texas, in my opinion. Again, nothing to do with the postseason. All of these teams that I'm going to talk about, the reasons that I consider these games must win are different from team to team. It's not all about, well, you got to win this game if you want to make the postseason or something like that. That Texas A&M game is going to be absolutely huge. Let's continue to scroll through. Ohio State. Now, this is an obvious one. No one's going to be surprised by this one here, but I'll go ahead and put Ohio State's schedule up on the screen. There it is. Yeah, I promise. There we go. No surprise here, but it's the Michigan game. And again, Ohio State's got some big games this year. I mean, on the road at Oregon here on October 12th at Michigan State. No huge non-con games, I guess. Really, what do they got? Akron, Western Michigan, and Marshall. So they have adopted the Michigan scheduling platform this year by playing nobody in the non-con. But they host Iowa. Iowa's an interesting team, brand new offensive staff. They should have a really good defense again. We'll see if the offense can get first down, something they haven't been able to do the last 3 or 4 years. The Nebraska game could be interesting. Obviously, you've got at Penn State. So there's a lot of big games on here for Ohio State. But look, any year you want to talk about, if we get to Michigan, it'll be the same thing. It's going to be the Ohio State game in both cases. This Michigan-Ohio State game is huge every single year. It's been more than huge the last couple of years when these two teams have met, when both have been undefeated or just with the one loss, with because of the 4-team playoff, basically a playoff invitation on the line here when these two teams have met each of the last 2 years. And while that might not be the case this year, it's of course possible for the loser of this game to make a 12-team playoff. For Ohio State in particular, after losing 3 straight to Michigan under Jim Harbaugh, similar to the Georgia with Alabama and Saban deal, right? Michigan's got a new coaching staff. Now, I know Sharon Moore was there last year, but he's still a new head coach. They lost a lot, especially on offense. Michigan's got a lot coming back on defense. Ohio State has accumulated one of the most talented rosters of all time. It's one of those things where, if Ryan Day and Ohio State can't beat Michigan this year, at home for Ohio State, then when are they going to beat them type of thing. So this is pretty obvious, and I feel like we don't even really need to spend a whole lot of time on it. Not because it's not important, not because it's not a must-win game. It is a must-win game for Ohio State, I think. but because that one is probably the most obvious that we'll look at with any of these teams here. Alabama. Does Alabama have a must-win game on the schedule this year? Probably not. And the reason I say that, again, it's got nothing to do with Alabama's relevance or how good I think they are or aren't or anything else. It's just, first-year head coach. They're one of the most talented teams in the country. Yeah, their schedule is different like everybody else's is in the SEC. But let's see. Let's pull up Alabama's schedule. Do they have a must-win game on here? Y'all tell me down in the comments. Here's their schedule. At Wisconsin, the Georgia game will be one of the biggest games of the year for sure for Bama. They coming off a bye week. It's at home. I don't know if I would consider that must-win for Bama. Like I mentioned, they're 5-1 against Kirby Smart and Kirby's time at Georgia. They just beat them last year. If Bama were to lose this game to Georgia at home, the fans wouldn't like it. But again, it wouldn't necessarily mean anything one way or the other for Alabama as a program or a team either this season or going forward, right? It would put Kirby at 2-5 against Bama. Now you do have the sort of sideline story of it being Kalen DeBoer's first season, and how does he handle some of these SEC games? But on the road at Tennessee, always a big game for Alabama every year. At LSU, I'm not that high on LSU this year. I don't see where they've improved defensively enough to really compete with any of the big boys in the SEC. I'll be surprised if they do. At Oklahoma, interesting game, again, with the Oklahoma being the new team in the SEC. And then, of course, you have the Iron Bowl at the end of the year. I guess you could consider that a must-win game. If you live in the state of Alabama and you're an Alabama or an Auburn fan, that is a must-win game, because if you lose it, you got to hear about it from your neighbor for 365 days. But from a national perspective, do y'all think there's like a must-win game on here for Bama? And if you do, let me know down below and tell me what it is about that. Why is that a must-win game? Let me know. But I don't really see one on here for Bama that sticks out to me like that. Continuing to scroll through the list, Penn State. Okay, this one we will do. We'll talk about Penn State. Let's pull their schedule up here. I'm going to have to type this one in because I don't have it pulled up already. Penn State football schedule 2024. There it is. I know what I'm doing. Believe me. Trust me too. At West Virginia, I mean, it's a big game to the people that live up that way. Far from a must-win game. They don't play. So the story of Penn State the last decade really has been, they're really good, but you can't beat Michigan and Ohio State, right? Well, they don't play Michigan this year thanks to realignment and a new scheduling format in the Big Ten. They do play Ohio State, and they get them at home. So what other big game do they have? Because, again, with Penn State, it's been, that's great. They go 10-2, but they lose to the two best teams they play every single year. Well, who are the two best teams they play this year? Obviously, one of them is Ohio State. They host them. But what's the second biggest game here on the schedule for Penn State? There are not a lot of big games here. At Southern Cal. Now, again, it's an interesting game because Southern Cal is new to the Big Ten. Penn State traveling East Coast to West Coast to take on the Trojans. But again, not a lot of expectations for Southern Cal this year. Lincoln Riley's defense is, still, free beer tomorrow deal on that. Brand new quarterback. Now, the offense will probably be good because Lincoln Riley's offense is always good. But again, what is like the second toughest game on this schedule? And the reason I ask, getting back to, must-win games for Penn State, if Penn State had the schedule that they normally have, then I would say, they have to beat their must-win game. They have to beat either Penn State or Michigan. They can't keep losing to those two teams every single year. That would be sort of the angle I would take for Penn State in a video like this if they had the same schedule they've normally had. But again, they don't. So you got that Ohio State game at home. Is that the must-win game? It probably is. But that's the best team they play. Whoever the second best team they play is a distant second. Most of these teams are not even ranked heading into the preseason. In fact, it looks like Ohio State is the only team Penn State plays that is ranked heading into the season. That does kind of make the Ohio State game must win. It's definitely the biggest game of the year for Penn State. We'll see if James Franklin and company can pull that one off. My guess would be no, that they can't, but we'll see. What other top teams do we have here? Notre Dame. Now, you might know my answer for this one if you have watched my Notre Dame or my Texas A&M prediction videos, because in each of those videos, I mentioned it. But to me, it's the Texas A&M game, and that's the first game of the season. And again, 12-team playoff, and Notre Dame's not in the conference, right? So could they lose this game and still make the playoffs? Well, yeah, an 11-1 Notre Dame, right? Assuming the loss was to Texas A&M, an 11-1 Notre Dame would have that loss to Texas A&M, but then they'd have a win over a most likely ranked Louisville team. They'd have a win against Florida State, and they'd have a win against Southern Cal. It'd be 11-1. They would probably still get in. So it's not a must-win game from a record standpoint. However, like I said in the videos, the prediction videos about Notre Dame, I don't think Texas A&M is very good. I like Mike Elko. I love that hire. I think he's going to take Texas A&M to a place they were unable to get to under Jimbo Fisher, but I don't think that's going to be this year. They've had just a ton of turnover on that roster through the transfer portal. Yes, they have signed some great classes over the last few years, and yes, they have brought in some transfers, but they have lost a lot of talent and a lot of players and a lot of experience off of that roster through the portal. You add a new coach to that, new schemes, new coordinators, the whole deal. And it's just hard for me to imagine that Texas A&M would be good enough year one under Mike Elko to beat a pretty good-looking Notre Dame team heading into next season. Now, they've got a new quarterback through the portal. Second year in a row they've tried this. We'll see how that works out. But my thought process here with Notre Dame, and again, I said it in the videos, the Texas A&M game is must win because, in my opinion, Texas A&M is about the 7th or 8th best team in the SEC this year. And perception becomes reality in college football when the playoff committee sits in that room and starts voting, and that's what they're doing. They're voting and discussing and debating on which 12 teams should make the college football playoff at the end of the year. And if the college football playoff committee is staring at a Notre Dame team that is either 11-1 or 10-2, and one of those losses is to Texas A&M, and they look on their piece of paper and they see that Texas A&M finished 7th, 8th, 9th in the SEC, whatever it is, it's going to become hard for that playoff committee to justify putting a 10-2 or 11-1 Notre Dame into the playoffs when they couldn't even beat the 6th, 7th, or 8th best SEC team. And what if it comes down to, let's even say an 11-1 Notre Dame. What if it comes down to an 11-1 Notre Dame and they're only lost to Texas A&M versus a 10-2 SEC team for one of the last playoff spots? And that 10-2 SEC team beat Texas A&M, or that 10-2 SEC team didn't play Texas A&M, but they finished 4th in the SEC. Meanwhile, Notre Dame lost to the 7th, 8th, or 9th best team in the SEC, Texas A&M. If they lose this Texas A&M game, it could become a big problem for Notre Dame at the end of the season when the playoff committee sits in that room to make these kinds of decisions. On top of which, I just don't think, if Notre Dame's not good enough to beat Texas A&M, then I think they probably have at least 2 more losses on their schedule, potentially Louisville, potentially even on the road at Georgia Tech, who could be improved this year. Obviously, the Florida State game, and then on the road at Southern Cal to end the year. So that Texas A&M game, to me, for Notre Dame, must-win game. A must-win game for Notre Dame in terms of playoff chances. Oklahoma. Is there a must-win game on the schedule for Oklahoma this season? Let's pull the schedule up and see. Nothing pops into my head right away with Oklahoma as a must-win game. Again, outside of the biggest game of the year every year for Oklahoma, which is the Texas game. But because they beat Texas last year, a loss to Texas wouldn't be the end of the world for an Oklahoma team that is picked to finish somewhere in the middle in the SEC, right? But they got Temple, Houston, and Tulane, okay? What about Tennessee? It might be the Tennessee game for Oklahoma if you were going to pinpoint a must-win game. And I'll go ahead and give a spoiler alert here. For Tennessee, their must-win game is Oklahoma. And again, this is something I've talked about a lot in the offseason, and I talked about during the Tennessee prediction video that I did. In fact, let's do Tennessee first and then come back to Oklahoma. Because it just dovetails good into the Oklahoma conversation if we do Tennessee first. So Tennessee, I think, is pretty good. I think they're should be in the top 15 in the preseason. I think that's deserved, and I think they have potential to finish inside the top 12 and potentially make a playoff. In fact, I have them at 10-2. They have to beat Oklahoma, though, on the road at Oklahoma. And it's a similar thing for me to the Notre Dame, Texas A&M deal. If Notre Dame's not good enough to beat Texas A&M early in the year, then that means they probably have additional losses on the schedule down the road. And to me, it's the same sort of thing when I look at Tennessee here. They play on the road at Oklahoma, an Oklahoma team whose defense has been bad the last couple of years. They've got a first-year starter at quarterback in Nico, and a very questionable at best offensive line there at Oklahoma against a Tennessee team who's got maybe the best defensive front in the SEC. It's really, really good. Pierce may be the best defensive player in all of the SEC, but their front as a whole is pretty good. Now, their secondary is suspect, and we'll find out if Jackson Arnold can take advantage of that, but Tennessee's going to have to go in here to Norman and win this game at Oklahoma, because if they're not good enough to win this game on the road at Oklahoma, then look down further on the schedule. They play Alabama. Do you really think if they can't beat Oklahoma that they're beating Alabama? They play on the road in Athens late in the year, November 16th. If you think they're not good enough to beat Oklahoma, do you really think they're going into Athens and winning? So the problem with Tennessee, if they lose this game, is not that they lose to Oklahoma. It's that if they can't beat Oklahoma, they've probably got 2 or 3 more losses on the schedule. So I think for Tennessee, the Oklahoma game becomes a must-win game in terms of playoff potential for Tennessee. And all right, now back to Oklahoma, and we'll pull them up. Sorry, I ended up doing that kind of backwards. Oklahoma plays Tennessee. They've got the game on the road at Auburn. Of course, the Texas game. They play at Ole Miss. They play at Mizzou. This is interesting, at Ole Miss and at Mizzou. Now, these are 2 teams that traditionally are not anywhere near the top of the SEC, right? But they're getting a lot of hype this offseason because of how they performed last year and what they have coming back. And in the case of Missouri in particular, a very favorable schedule. Can Oklahoma win both of those games on the road at Ole Miss and at Missouri? Then they play Alabama following a bye week, and then, they end the regular season at LSU. There's nothing obvious to me on here about Oklahoma that says this is a must-win game. I don't think Oklahoma's making the playoffs. I no secret about it. I'm not an Oklahoma hater. I think Jackson Arnold needs a year under his belt. I got to see that offensive line. I have to see the defense perform better before I can be confident enough in that to pick them for the playoffs. I think Oklahoma probably wins 7 or 8 games this year and then has a lot of hype, especially if Jackson Arnold has a good year and Oklahoma wins 7 or 8 games, then you're going to have a lot of hype behind Oklahoma heading into next season. So I don't think Oklahoma's a playoff team this year. So there's no game on here that I would go, well, they got to win this one if they want to make the playoffs, because I don't think they're making the playoffs. The Texas game would seem like an obvious pick for Oklahoma, but because Brent Venables has the win over Texas last year, I don't know that you would necessarily consider that to be a must-win game. But again, if you saw one on there, let me know in the comments section down below what game you think it is for Oklahoma, must-win game. Tennessee is next on ESPN's FPI list at 9. We just talked about them. At 10, Missouri. Boy, just mentioned Missouri's schedule. I'll pull it up and show it to you here. I don't know if there's a must-win game on here because there's just not a lot of big games on here for Missouri. I don't know who they... well, somebody at the SEC office did them a favor. We'll just say that. But you look at their first 3 games, they're absolutely nothing burgers. The chances are no one is going to even watch Missouri play until that game in October at Texas A&M. I mean, they got Murray State, Buffalo, Boston College in the non-con, and then their first SEC game is at home against Vandy. I mean, is there anybody that thinks Missouri's not starting 4-0? I mean, I don't think there is. Bye week, and then they play on the road at Texas A&M. Maybe this is the must-win game for Missouri because they're going to have played absolutely nobody up to that point in the season. We're going to be at October 5th, and Missouri's going to be undefeated. And because of that, they're probably going to be in the top 10. Not here to tell you I think they're one of the 10 best teams. I'm predicting what the AP ranking might look like on October 5th when this game is played on the road at Texas A&M. Missouri is going to start out ranked pretty high, and they're not losing any of these first 4 games, and then week 5 is a bye. They're going to move up because teams ahead of them are going to lose, right? So they're probably going to be in the top 10 when they play on the road at Texas A&M. So their first true test of the year, most likely the first game that the majority of people have seen Missouri play. Just not very, look, no disrespect to Missouri. Yeah, Missouri fans will watch them beat up on Murray State, and they'll watch them play Boston College and Vandy. But I mean, the college football public in general is not going to watch any of those first 4 games that they play. The first time there'll be a lot of eyeballs on Missouri is going to be coming off that bye week on October 5th on the road at Texas A&M. And again, like I mentioned, they're going to be in the top. They're going to be in the top 10 at that point. We'll see about Texas A&M. They've got a chance to surprise some people early if they can beat Notre Dame. We'll see where they're at this point in the year, but that's irrelevant. Texas A&M is clearly the best team Missouri will have played up to this point, and the only game anybody will have watched. And if Missouri were to come out and lay an egg here in this game on the road at Texas A&M, it would be hard for them to recover from a perception standpoint, right? Even if they went on to win out the rest of this schedule at UMass in the middle of the year for no reason. Auburn, no quarterback and not very good. On the road at Bama, okay, that's another one they could lose, right? Oklahoma could lose that one. But then at South Carolina and at Mississippi State and finishing up with Arkansas, I mean, those last three games are against probably three of the worst five teams in the SEC. I mean, you're talking South Carolina, Mississippi State, Arkansas, probably Florida, Vandy. Those are your five worst teams probably in the SEC. Missouri ends the year with three of those five, so those look like wins. So they've really just got to avoid a couple of landmines between Texas A&M, Bama, and Oklahoma. What if they win two of those games? Well, if they win two of those games, they're 11-1. They're in the SEC championship game, and they're most likely in the playoffs too. What if they lose two of them, though, and miss out on the SEC championship game? Would they get in as a at-large team at 10-2? Probably not if they lost to two of those three teams, because they would really just have no other big win to stand on. I mean, so the Texas A&M game, I think, is huge for a perception standpoint. So we'll go with Texas A&M there for the must-win game for Missouri. I don't know how long this video is. Maybe we should start to wrap it up. Florida State, it comes in at number 11 on ESPN's FBI ranking. There you see it right there. Let's put their schedule up on the screen. I know they play Boston College and Georgia Tech early in the year. Here it is. Okay. What is the must-win game? You know what? This one might surprise you a little because they've got some big games at SMU. You know, big, huge game. SMU would love to beat Florida State. They're new to the ACC. I think that's SMU's first ACC game. I could be wrong, but I think that's their first ACC game. It's a home game. Be a crazy environment there. So that'll be big. Follow that up with a home game against Clemson. That'll obviously be a huge game. At Miami, I mean, I don't need to say anything about that. Florida State, Miami, one of the biggest rivals in the last 30 years of college football. At Notre Dame, and then an in-state rival to close it out with Florida. But I think the biggest game of the year for Florida State is Georgia Tech. You know, Florida State fans are still pretending that no one watched the Orange Bowl and that 63-3 didn't really happen. And even though everybody knows Florida State had players sit out and opt out and quit and whatever else for the draft and their feelings were hurt, we all know that. Everybody has players quit and sit out and don't want to play in bowl games anymore, though. And not everybody loses by 60. The last time we saw Florida State take the field, they got beat by 60. That's the bottom line. Now, all the but this and yeah, well, but that and yeah, this guy say, I mean, all of that is an afterthought, okay? The last time anybody saw Florida State play a football game, they got beat by 60. They might not ever recover if they open up this season in Ireland with a loss to Georgia Tech, a team that hardly anybody takes seriously. I am a little higher on Georgia Tech than the average idiot is, I'll admit it. But I think Georgia Tech has a chance to keep this game close if they can avoid turning the ball over, which is last year they could not do. They turned the ball over like it was their job last year, Georgia Tech, them and Clemson both. But they are an improved team. They are heading in the right direction under Brent Key. Are they close to being a playoff team? No, they're years away from that. But they're better than that. Well, I'll say this about Georgia Tech. They're better than the public perception of them. I'll say that. And if Florida State shows up with the poor, pitiful me routine and they've spent the last 8 months crying about December instead of looking forward to this year's football season, they run the potential of showing up and getting absolutely embarrassed here by Georgia Tech. And by embarrassed, I mean losing by 1 point. Because if you lose to Georgia Tech, it's going to be embarrassing. And Florida State just can't afford the public relations nightmare that would ensue coming off a 60-point loss. Again, all the excuses, fine, you can list them. Bottom line, last time we saw Florida State play, they lost by 60. They follow that up with a loss to Georgia Tech, it will be hard to overcome that. So I'm actually gonna say, even though they got a ton of big games, and you know Georgia Tech would be 7th or 8th on the list probably if you were just ranking like how big are these games for Florida State. I think that Georgia Tech game is must win for Florida State. And to be fair, I did pick Florida State to win that game. Now, they're a 13-point favorite, I think, last time I looked over Georgia Tech. I'd take Georgia Tech in the points. I think it could be closer than that, but I did pick Florida State to win, so I want to get the Seminole fans too riled up. They'll send that Indian mob after me in that. I tell you what, I'm going to stop it there. I went through the 11 teams. Michigan would be next on the list, but I feel like this video is probably already getting to the point where it's a little bit too long. I tell you what, if you enjoyed this video, let me know down below, and maybe I'll make a part 2 where I come back and I'll start with Michigan and finish out the top 20 or something. I've done the top 11 teams here in this video, but let me know what you think down below about some of these games. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know. I do appreciate you watching, though, and have a good morning.